The encounter. The sharp voice of Officer Derek Mathers cut through the vibrant atmosphere of the grocery store parking lot in downtown Atlanta. It was a sunny afternoon, but the air felt tense as if it were holding its breath. Nia Robinson, a poised African-American woman in her late 30s, sat behind the wheel of her sleek black Mercedes. The engine purred softly, a stark contrast to the sudden authoritative presence approaching her vehicle. "Excuse me, ma'am." "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Mathers commanded, his stance rigid and his hand resting ominously close to his holstered gun. Nia's brow furrowed slightly as she registered the tone in his voice. It was the same tone she had heard far too often, one that dripped with condescension and implied authority, especially when directed at people who looked like her. Taking a deep breath, Nia forced herself to remain calm. She had spent years honing her composure in the courtroom as a civil rights attorney, and she knew the importance of maintaining her dignity in confrontational situations. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with irritation. Mathers, a tall man with a reputation for being aggressive, peered down at her through his mirrored sunglasses. He was used to people cowering at his demands, but there was something different about Nia. She wasn't flustered. She was merely irritated. "License and registration," he ordered flatly, the words coming out as a command rather than a request. Nia reached for her purse, her mind racing. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, not from fear, but from the simmering anger at being treated like a criminal simply because of her skin color. As she handed over her documents, she locked eyes with Mathers, her expression defiant. "Here you go, officer. Everything is in order." His eyes flicked to her name on the license, and for a brief moment he paused. "Nia Robinson," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue as if it were a curse. To him, it was just another name that came with preconceived notions. "Where are you headed, Miss Robinson?" "I'm on my way home from work," she replied, keeping her tone even. But the edge had returned. "Work, huh?" he sneered, taking the step closer, his posture widening as if to assert dominance. "In a car like this. Must be nice. What do you do, Miss Robinson?" "I'm a lawyer," she stated, her voice firm. The weight of the words hung in the air, but Mathers dismissed them as quickly as they came. In his mind, she was simply another black woman in a fancy car, a stereotype he had long learned to exploit. "A lawyer, huh?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Which firm do you work for?" Nia felt the tension in her chest tighten. "You'll find out soon enough, officer," she replied, a subtle challenge woven into her words. But Mathers wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he perceived as beneath him. "Step out of the car," he ordered again, his tone no longer a request but a demand. Nia's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to step out of my vehicle unless you have a legitimate reason to make that request," she said, her calm demeanor hiding the whirlwind of emotions brewing beneath the surface. She had encountered officers like him before, men who felt empowered by their badges and sought to exert control over others without justification. "Just do as I say," Mathers barked, frustration creeping into his voice. Nia stood her ground, knowing that her rights were being violated. "Officer, unless you're formally arresting me, I have no obligation to comply with your illegal request," she said, her voice steady but firm. The words seemed to hang in the air, resonating with the onlookers who had begun to gather, phones out and recording the confrontation. The parking lot had transformed from a bustling hub of activity to a stage for a public spectacle. Nia felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, and with each passing moment, she found her resolve strengthening. She was not just a target for this officer's aggression. She was a woman of power and purpose, and she would not back down. Mathers's face flushed with anger. He had expected her to submit to his authority, to flinch under the pressure of his presence. Instead, she was challenging him, and it infuriated him. "I said hands on the hood," he shouted, the command echoing in the stillness that had fallen over the spectators. Nia raised an eyebrow, incredulous. For what reason, officer? Am I under arrest? The tension in the air crackled as bystanders began to murmur among themselves, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Just do what I say. He barked again, and this time his frustration boiled over. Nea's heart raced, not from fear, but from the indignation of being treated like this. She had faced bullies before, and she wasn't about to let this man reduce her to a victim. I will not comply with your unlawful order, she stated firmly, her voice unwavering. You're trying to intimidate me, but I know my rights. The officer's hand twitched, hovering over her arm, and Nia held her ground, her expression hardening. You know, I've taken down officers like you before, she continued, her voice calm yet resolute. You touch me without cause, and you'll be violating my constitutional rights. I guarantee I'll make sure everyone knows about it. In that moment, doubt flickered in Mathers's eyes, his hand hovering inches from her arm. The power dynamics were shifting, and he was losing control. The crowd that had gathered watched with bated breath, sensing the tension and the potential for this encounter to escalate. Nia could see the realization dawn on Mathers, the weight of her words, the challenge in her gaze. She wasn't just another person to push around. She was an attorney, and she knew how to fight back. The adrenaline coursed through her, not because she was scared, but because she felt empowered. The onlookers began to murmur, their phones still recording, and she could feel the tide turning in her favor. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against a system that had long been designed to intimidate and control. Think very carefully about your next move, Officer Mathers, she warned, her voice low and steady. This could end badly for you if you choose to continue down this path. With the eyes of the crowd on him, Mathers slowly stepped back, his bravado crumbling as he weighed his options. He wasn't used to someone like her, someone who wouldn't back down, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. The power he thought he held was slipping away, and it terrified him. Nia took a deep breath, grounding herself in the moment. She was determined not to let him intimidate her any longer. Today, she would reclaim her narrative, and she would make sure that he remembered her name. The crowd continued to gather, drawn by the spectacle of the confrontation. As Mathers retreated slightly, the tension began to dissipate, but Nia knew this was only the beginning. She would make sure that the world knew what had transpired here today. An officer's arrogance had met its match in her resilience, and she would not let this incident fade into obscurity. As the people around her began to cheer quietly in support, Nia felt a rush of hope. She was not alone in this fight, and she was ready to stand tall and proud, regardless of the odds stacked against her. Today was a day of empowerment, and she would make it count. The stand. As Officer Mathers stepped back, the weight of the moment began to shift. Nia Robinson stood tall, the tension in her body radiating a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding her. The murmurs of the crowd intensified, curiosity transforming into collective outrage at the sight of a woman standing her ground against an officer who had assumed he could exert his authority without consequence. Nia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but it wasn't fear that fueled her. It was determination. She had fought hard to carve out her place in a world that often sought to belittle her and others like her. She was not merely a lawyer. She was a warrior for justice, and today she was ready to take on that fight in a way she had never imagined. Step away from the vehicle, Miss Robinson, Mathers finally said, attempting to regain his composure, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. The glint of doubt in his eyes was unmistakable, and the moment hung in the air, electric with possibility. No, officer, Nia replied, her voice steady and resolute. I'm not going anywhere until you explain why you stopped me and why you think it's acceptable to treat me this way. The crowd around them began to grow, and several onlookers recorded the confrontation, their smartphones capturing every moment. Nia felt a surge of power at the realization that she was not alone. Bystanders, many of whom were familiar with the oppressive nature of certain police tactics, stood in solidarity, their presence offering her strength. "What's your badge number?" Nia demanded, her eyes locked on Mathers with an intensity that brooked no argument. The question hung in the air, demanding an answer, and the officer hesitated, the uncertainty palpable. "You're required to identify yourself, Officer Mathers. If you continue to escalate this situation, I will file a complaint against you." "Don't threaten me, girl," Mathers snapped, trying to maintain control over the situation. "I'm the one in charge here. You may wear a badge, but you do not have the right to abuse your power," Nia shot back, her voice calm yet fierce. The crowd began to murmur in agreement, emboldened by her words. Suddenly, another voice broke through the crowd. "This isn't right. Let her go." An older woman stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. The call for justice resonated, sparking murmurs of support from those gathered. They began to echo the sentiment, a chorus of voices challenging the authority that sought to intimidate. Mathers shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was losing the narrative. He glanced around, searching for support from his fellow officers, but instead he saw faces that reflected a mixture of concern and skepticism. He was not used to being challenged publicly, and the situation was spiraling out of his control. Nia seized the moment, pressing her advantage. "I will not be intimidated. I know my rights, and I will not allow you or anyone else to trample over them." Her voice was unwavering, resonating with a confidence that shocked Mathers. She had not only challenged his authority, she had also challenged the systemic injustice that he represented. In that moment, she became more than just a woman in a car. She was a symbol of resilience against a force that sought to undermine her. With every passing second, the crowd grew bolder. "She's a lawyer," someone shouted, emphasizing her credentials. "You can't treat her like this." The shouts ignited a fire within the crowd, a shared resolve to stand up against the abuse of power. Mathers was now on the defensive. "You're just making this worse for yourself," he warned, though his voice lacked conviction. "You should comply and stop making a scene." "Comply with what?" "Being treated like a criminal for no reason." Nia replied, her voice rising to meet the challenge. "I will not be a victim today." The resolve in her tone sent ripples through the crowd, sparking further support. As more people began to gather, Nia felt the shift in momentum. She was no longer alone. She was backed by a community that recognized the injustice unfolding before them. The cameras kept rolling, documenting the confrontation, and Nia was determined to ensure that this moment would not fade into the background of indifference. "What happens now, officer?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "Are you going to escalate this further, or are you going to do the right thing and let me go?" Mathers faltered, caught between his instinct to assert authority and the reality of the situation. The eyes of the crowd were upon him, filled with judgment and disapproval. He had always thrived on intimidation, but today was different. Today, he faced a woman who wouldn't back down. As he opened his mouth to respond, a senior officer stepped into the fray. Officer Daniels, a veteran with years of experience and a reputation for integrity, arrived on the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, assessing the situation with a discerning gaze. Nia turned her attention to Officer Daniels, sensing the shift in dynamics. "I was pulled over without cause, and Officer Mathers is trying to intimidate me," she explained, her voice calm and collected. "I'm simply exercising my rights." Daniels looked at Mathers, then back at Nia, his expression serious. "Is that true, Mathers?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Just doing my job," Mathers replied defensively, but the edge in his voice was softer now. He could feel the pressure mounting, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. "You have a responsibility to uphold the law, not to abuse your authority," Daniels said firmly. "If this woman is not a threat, then you should let her go." Nia felt a rush of hope. The presence of Officer Daniels shifted the tide further in her favor, and she could sense the crowd rallying behind her cause. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel a sense of empowerment. "Thank you, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady. I appreciate your willingness to uphold justice. I have done nothing wrong today." "Exactly," Daniels nodded, his eyes focused on Mathers. "Let her go. This is unnecessary." With that, Mathers stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment as he realized he was losing the battle. The crowd erupted in supportive cheers as Nia stood her ground, an undeniable force of resilience and courage. As the tension began to dissipate, Nia took a moment to gather herself. She had faced down an officer who sought to demean her, and in doing so, she had rallied a community that stood against injustice. She was no longer just a woman in a car. She was a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence. Mathers turned to leave, the humiliation evident on his face. Nia watched as he retreated, feeling a sense of victory wash over her. Today was not just a win for her. It was a win for everyone who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. As the crowd began to disperse, Nia felt the weight of their support surrounding her. She had made a stand, and it had resonated deeply. Today would be a day she would not forget, a day that would become a powerful part of her journey as a civil rights attorney dedicated to fighting for justice and equality. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but now it was filled with hope and determination. She knew the fight was far from over, but today she had proven that courage could challenge even the most oppressive forces, and with every battle she would continue to rise, inspired by the strength of those who stood with her. As she got back into her car, she felt the resolve harden within her. This was just the beginning of her journey, and she was ready to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The aftermath. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the grocery store parking lot as Nia Robinson sat in her car, her heart still racing from the confrontation with Officer Mathers. The moment had felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins reminded her that it was all too real. She had stood her ground against a man who wielded his badge like a weapon, and for that, she felt both empowered and vulnerable. As she took a moment to collect herself, Nia could hear the distant chatter of the crowd that had gathered around her. The murmurs of support lingered in the air, a reminder that she was not alone in her struggle. She closed her eyes and let the sounds wash over her, reminding herself of the strength she had drawn from the people around her. Yet, the encounter with Mathers had opened a floodgate of emotions. She knew that her fight was far from over. This was just one battle in a much larger war against systemic injustice. Nia had spent years fighting for the rights of others, but it had always been in the courtroom, where rules were clear and the fight was structured. This was different. This was personal. As she finally turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, Nia's mind raced with thoughts of the incident. She had faced police brutality before. Stories of others who had come forward with their experiences flooded her mind, but today was different. She had faced it firsthand, and it left her unsettled yet resolute. Nia parked her car outside her apartment building and took a moment to breathe deeply before stepping inside. The familiar surroundings provided a sense of comfort, but the weight of the day's events followed her like a shadow. She entered her living room and sank into the sofa, her mind swirling with the implications of what had just happened. Reaching for her phone, Nia opened her social media accounts, intent on sharing her experience. She knew that the more people understood the realities of racial profiling and police brutality, the more allies she would have in her fight for justice. Nia began typing, pouring her heart into the post, describing the incident with Mathers in detail, highlighting the fearlessness she had felt in the face of intimidation. As she wrote, she felt a sense of catharsis. Her fingers danced over the screen, and with each word, she gained strength. She wanted to inspire others who had experienced similar injustices to speak out, to take a stand, and to believe in their right to be treated with dignity. After sharing her story, Nia felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew that her post would spark conversation, some supportive, some likely critical, but she was ready for it. The backlash would not deter her. It would only fuel her fire. That night, as Nia prepared for bed, her phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. People were reacting to her post, sharing their own experiences, and expressing solidarity. The comments section exploded with stories of similar encounters, of moments when people had been marginalized, belittled, or disrespected by those in authority. Naya felt a sense of community forming around her, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose. She drifted off to sleep with the resolve that this was just the beginning. She would not allow Mathers or anyone else to dictate her narrative. Instead, she would be the author of her own story and the stories of others like her. The next morning, Nia woke up to the sunlight streaming through her window, casting warm rays across her room. She felt a sense of clarity and determination as she began her day. After getting dressed, she decided to head to the local cafe where she often worked on her cases. It was a place of comfort, filled with familiar faces, and today she wanted to surround herself with the support of her community. As she walked into the cafe, she noticed a few patrons looking at her with interest, recognizing her from the viral post. Naya smiled at them, feeling the surge of empowerment. She ordered her usual coffee and found a corner table, opening her laptop to dive into her work. But her mind kept drifting back to the previous day's confrontation. While she worked, she overheard snippets of conversations around her. People discussing the incident, expressing disbelief at Mathers' actions, and vowing to support Nia in any way they could. The more she listened, the more she realized that her story had resonated with many. This wasn't just about her. It was about a collective struggle against injustice. As she began to draft a new legal brief for an upcoming case, Naya received a text from her mentor, an influential civil rights attorney. "I saw your post. Let's meet. I have some ideas on how we can amplify your message and take action." Her heart raced at the prospect. This was the kind of support she needed, guidance from someone who had walked this path before her. They arranged to meet later that day at a nearby law office. Naya felt a renewed sense of purpose as she finished her coffee and packed up her things. She was no longer just an individual fighting a battle. She was becoming part of a movement. When she arrived at the law office, her mentor welcomed her with open arms, and they settled into a conference room filled with books and legal documents. "I want you to know that what you did yesterday was incredibly brave," her mentor began, looking Nia directly in the eyes. "But it's just the first step. We need to turn this momentum into action." Nia nodded, eager to hear her mentor's ideas. "I want to organize a community forum," her mentor continued. "A place for people to share their stories, to come together, and discuss their experiences with law enforcement. We can invite local leaders, activists, and even legal experts to speak. Let's empower the community to stand up against injustice." Excitement bubbled within Nia as she imagined the possibilities. This was her chance to create a platform for change, a way for voices to be heard. "I love that idea," she exclaimed. "We need to make sure people know they're not alone in this fight." With each idea they bounced back and forth, Naya felt her vision coming to life. They discussed logistics, how to promote the event, and who to invite. The plan began to take shape, and she felt invigorated by the prospect of uniting her community in this important cause. By the end of their meeting, they had mapped out a strategy to make the forum happen within the next month. Naya left the law office feeling energized and hopeful. She had the opportunity to make a difference, not just for herself, but for countless others who had faced similar challenges. Over the following weeks, Nia poured her heart and soul into organizing the community forum. She reached out to local organizations, gathered resources, and spread the word on social media. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and the buzz around the event began to grow. People were eager to share their stories, to stand together against injustice, and to be heard. As the day of the forum approached, Naya felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. She was stepping into a role that she had longed for, a leader, a voice for change. The support from her mentor and the community bolstered her confidence, reminding her that she was not alone. On the day of the forum, the venue buzzed with energy as people gathered, sharing their experiences and connecting with one another. Nia took a moment to look around, seeing faces filled with hope and determination. This was what she had envisioned, a space for empowerment, healing, and solidarity. The event kicked off with inspiring speeches from local activists, followed by a panel discussion where people shared their personal stories of injustice and resilience. Nia spoke passionately about her encounter with Officer Mathers, detailing the importance of standing up against discrimination and the power of community support. As the evening unfolded, the room filled with a sense of unity. Attendees shared their emotions, exchanged contact information, and vowed to continue the fight together. Nia felt a profound sense of purpose. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A chance to be part of something greater. After the forum concluded, Nia received countless messages of gratitude. People approached her, thanking her for creating a space where they could express their struggles and feel supported. The connections made that night would last long after the event, forming a network of advocates ready to stand up for justice. As Nia left the venue, she felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. The fight against injustice was far from over, but she was no longer just a solitary warrior. She had a community behind her, ready to make a difference. And in that moment, she knew that together, they could change the world. The ripple effect. The days following the community forum were a whirlwind of activity for Nia Robinson. The event had sparked something powerful in the community, igniting conversations about race, justice, and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. Nia found herself at the center of this movement, fielding phone calls, emails, and messages from people eager to join the cause. As a civil rights attorney, she had always understood the importance of advocacy, but now she felt the full weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The momentum from the forum had created a ripple effect that she couldn't ignore. She knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, and it was time to take the next step. One afternoon, as she was working at her desk, Nia received a call from a local news station. The reporter on the line wanted to interview her about the forum and her personal experiences with Officer Mathers. Nia felt a surge of excitement mixed with trepidation. This was an opportunity to reach a broader audience, to share her story on a larger platform. "Of course, I'd be happy to talk," Nia replied, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts in her mind. She knew that media exposure could amplify her message and encourage more people to speak out against injustice. The following day, Nia arrived at the news station, her heart pounding with anticipation. The studio was bustling with activity, lights flashing, and technicians setting up equipment. She was ushered into a small interview room, and as the cameras began rolling, Nia felt a sense of purpose wash over her. The anchor introduced her, and Nia took a deep breath, focusing on the importance of what she was about to share. "Thank you for having me," she began, her voice clear and confident. "I believe it's crucial to talk about the experiences of individuals who face discrimination and injustice, especially at the hands of those sworn to protect us." As the interview progressed, Nia recounted her encounter with Officer Mathers, detailing the humiliation she had felt and the determination that had driven her to stand her ground. "I am a lawyer, but that doesn't shield me from the prejudices that exist in our society," she stated. "We all have a responsibility to speak out against these injustices and to support one another." The anchor nodded, visibly engaged with her story. "Your courage in confronting Officer Mathers is inspiring," he said. "What do you hope will come from sharing your experiences?" Nia leaned forward, her passion shining through. "I hope to encourage others who have been treated unfairly to share their stories as well. We need to create a culture where people feel empowered to stand up for their rights, no matter the situation." After the interview concluded, Nia left the studio feeling energized. She had taken another step forward in her fight for justice, and she was eager to see how her words would resonate with the public. In the days that followed, Nia's interview aired, and the response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from viewers across the city and beyond, many sharing their own experiences of racial profiling and discrimination. Nia was struck by the number of people who reached out, expressing gratitude for her bravery and willingness to speak out. As she read through the messages, Nia realized that she was part of a much larger narrative. People were ready to share their stories, ready to stand together against the injustices they faced. This realization fueled her resolve to continue the work she had started. One evening, as she was preparing dinner at home, Nia received a call from her mentor, who had been following the impact of the forum and her media appearances closely. "Nia, I'm so proud of you," her mentor began, her voice filled with warmth. "What you've done is remarkable, and I believe we can take this further." "What do you mean?" Nia asked, intrigued. "We need to organize a series of workshops, educational sessions on civil rights, how to handle encounters with law enforcement, and the importance of advocacy," her mentor suggested. "You've inspired so many already. Imagine the impact you could have if we formalize this effort." Nia felt a spark of excitement ignite within her. "That sounds incredible. I'd love to help organize the workshops," she replied eagerly. Over the next few weeks, Nia and her mentor worked tirelessly to put together the curriculum for the workshops. They reached out to local activists, lawyers, and community leaders, inviting them to participate and share their knowledge. The response was enthusiastic, with many eager to contribute to the cause. As the workshops approached, Nia felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. This was her chance to empower her community in a tangible way, to equip them with the tools they needed to advocate for themselves and others. She poured her heart into the planning, ensuring that each session would be informative, engaging, and inspiring. On the day of the first workshop, Nia arrived at the community center early, her heart racing with excitement. She was greeted by familiar faces and new ones alike, each person eager to learn and participate. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. As the workshop began, Nia took center stage, feeling the weight of the moment. "Welcome, everyone," she said, her voice ringing with enthusiasm. "Today, we're here to empower ourselves and each other. We've all faced challenges, but together, we can create change." The first session focused on understanding civil rights and the laws that protect individuals from discrimination. Nia and her fellow presenters engaged the audience, encouraging questions and discussions. The participants shared their own stories, fostering a sense of community and understanding among them. As the workshops continued, Nia saw a transformation in the attendees. People began to feel more confident, more willing to voice their concerns and share their experiences. They practiced scenarios involving police encounters, learning how to advocate for themselves in real-time situations. During one session, a young woman stood up, her voice shaking as she shared a recent experience with law enforcement. "I was stopped just a few weeks ago, and I didn't know how to respond," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But after listening to all of you, I feel like I can handle it differently next time." Nia felt a wave of empathy wash over her. This was why she had embarked on this journey, to help others find their strength, and to create a space for healing and empowerment. "You're not alone," Nia said gently. "We're all in this together, and your voice matters." The workshop series continued to grow, with more participants attending each session. Nia found herself thriving in this role, enjoying the energy and passion that filled the room. She had become a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for those seeking justice in a world that often felt indifferent. As the final workshop approached, Nia reflected on the journey she had undertaken. From the confrontation with Officer Mathers to organizing these workshops, she had found her voice, and more importantly, she had helped others find theirs. But as the success of the workshops became more apparent, so did the pushback. There were whispers of discontent within the local law enforcement community. Mathers, humiliated by the attention surrounding Nia's case, had begun to rally support among his colleagues. They viewed Nia's activism as a direct threat to their authority. Nia received a warning from her mentor about the potential backlash. "You need to be careful, Nia," her mentor advised during one of their meetings. Some in law enforcement won't take kindly to what you're doing." Nia nodded, acknowledging the reality of the situation. "I understand, but I can't back down now. This is bigger than me. It's about creating change for everyone." Her determination burned brighter than ever. The journey ahead might be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to confront them head-on. With the support of her community and her unwavering spirit, she felt empowered to continue the fight for justice, knowing that each step forward was a step toward a brighter future for all. As she prepared for the final workshop, Nia looked out at the crowd gathering outside the community center. They were there to stand together, to learn and grow as advocates for justice. In that moment, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, at the forefront of a movement that could change lives. The fight for justice would continue, and she was determined to lead the charge. The backlash. The success of Nia Robinson's community workshops did not go unnoticed. While the events had been a source of inspiration for those in attendance, they had also ruffled feathers within the local law enforcement community. Officer Mathers, humiliated by his confrontation with Nia and angered by the public attention, began to use his influence to sow seeds of dissent among his colleagues. To him, Nia's activism wasn't about justice. It was a direct challenge to his authority, and he wasn't going to let it go unanswered. Rumors began to swirl within the precinct. Mathers painted a picture of Nia as a dangerous agitator, someone who was stirring up trouble and inciting people against the police. His narrative was fueled by fear that the growing movement for accountability would threaten the unspoken code of silence that had protected officers like him for years. His fellow officers, many of whom harbored similar biases, began to view Nia as an enemy, rather than as someone advocating for fairness and justice. Nia, meanwhile, remained focused on her work. The community workshops had been a success beyond her wildest dreams, and the participants were eager to continue learning and taking action. She found herself inundated with requests for more sessions, more opportunities for people to connect and share their stories. It was clear that this was just the beginning of a larger movement. However, the backlash from law enforcement started to manifest in subtle ways. Nia noticed police cars patrolling her neighborhood more frequently, their headlights lingering a little too long in front of her house. She received strange phone calls, silent ones that hung up as soon as she answered. It was clear that someone was trying to intimidate her, to send a message that she should back off. But Nia was undeterred. One evening, as she was heading home from a late meeting at the law office, she noticed a police cruiser tailing her car. The flashing blue and red lights filled her rearview mirror, and her heart sank as she realized what was happening. She pulled over to the side of the road, her mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a warning. The officer approached her window, his expression unreadable. "Good evening, Miss Robinson," he said, his voice flat and cold. Mind stepping out of the vehicle. Nia kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her heart pounding. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" she asked, maintaining a calm tone despite the fear bubbling up inside her. "Routine traffic stop," he replied, though the look in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Please step out of the car." Nia complied, her body tense as she got out of the car. The officer frisked her roughly, his hands lingering a bit too long. It was demeaning, designed to humiliate and assert control. Nia's mind raced back to her encounter with Mathers, the way he had tried to dominate her through fear. This was more of the same, a continuation of the effort to silence her voice. "You're making waves around here, Miss Robinson," the officer said, leaning in close enough for her to feel his breath on her cheek. "People don't like that. You'd do well to keep a low profile." "I have a right to speak out," Nia shot back, her voice laced with anger. "And I won't be silenced." The officer smirked, stepping back. "Just a word of advice," he said before walking back to his cruiser. "Be careful out there. Accidents happen." As she watched the taillights of the cruiser fade into the distance, Nia felt a chill run down her spine. The message was clear: back off, or there would be consequences. But instead of fear, The encounter filled her with resolve. If they were trying this hard to silence her, then she must be doing something right. The next day, Nia met with her mentor to discuss the latest incident. "You need to be careful, Nia," her mentor warned, concern etched across her face. "They're trying to intimidate you. You're pushing buttons, and they're scared." "I know," Nia replied, "but that only means we need to push harder. We've come too far to turn back now." Together, they devised a plan to keep the momentum going. They would host a public rally, a larger, more visible event that would draw attention not just to Nia's personal story, but to the systemic issues plaguing the community. They would invite local politicians, journalists, activists, anyone who could help amplify their message. The rally would be risky. It would put a target on Nia's back, make her an even bigger threat in the eyes of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But Nia was ready. She was tired of playing it safe, tired of accepting small victories. It was time to make a statement. The day of the rally arrived, and the air buzzed with anticipation. People began to gather at the downtown park, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Police Brutality." Nia watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as the crowd continued to grow. There were familiar faces from the workshops, as well as new ones, people who had been inspired by her story and wanted to be part of the movement. The speakers lined up to take the stage, each one delivering a powerful message of hope and resilience. Nia listened intently, feeling the energy build with each word. This was what she had dreamed of, a community united in their fight for justice. When it was her turn to speak, Nia took the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. She looked out at the sea of faces, feeling the surge of emotion rise within her. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Today, we stand together against injustice. Today, we make it known that our voices will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Nia felt tears well up in her eyes. She spoke from the heart, sharing her story once more, the encounter with Mathers, the backlash she had faced, the attempts to intimidate her. "But I am still here," she declared, her voice rising with conviction. "We are still here, and we will not back down." The cheers grew louder, a wave of sound that filled the air with hope and determination. As she finished her speech, Nia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had faced down her fears and come out stronger on the other side. This was her community, and together, they would make a difference. But as the rally continued, Nia noticed a group of police officers gathered near the edge of the park, their expressions grim. She recognized Mathers among them, his face twisted with anger as he watched her from a distance. He wasn't just observing, he was taking notes, calculating his next move. Nia refused to be intimidated. She turned her back on him, focusing instead on the crowd, the faces filled with hope and determination. This was what mattered, not the threats, not the intimidation tactics. She would not let fear dictate her actions. After the rally ended, Nia stayed behind to speak with attendees, listening to their stories, offering advice, and connecting them with resources. The sense of solidarity was palpable, and Nia felt more committed than ever to the cause. As the last of the attendees trickled out of the park, Nia sat down on a bench, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. She had given everything she had to this movement, and while the fight was far from over, she was proud of what they had accomplished. Just as she was about to leave, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Mathers standing there, his face barely containing his rage. "You think this is over?" he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you're up against." Nia stood up slowly, facing him head-on. "I know exactly what I'm up against," she replied. "And I'm not afraid of you." Mathers smirked, stepping closer. "You should be," he whispered. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Nia standing alone in the fading light. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of determination. He could threaten her all he wanted. She wasn't backing down. That night, as she lay in bed, Naya thought about everything that had brought her to this point. The struggles, the victories, the moments of fear and doubt. She had come too far to turn back now. No matter what Mathers or anyone else did, she would continue to fight. For justice, for her community, for herself. And as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was prepared to see it through to the end. Together with her community, she would keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. Because some battles were worth fighting, no matter how difficult they might be. Justice at the crossroads. The weeks following the rally were tense and unpredictable for Naya Robinson. The threats and intimidation tactics from Officer Mathers and his allies had not subsided. In fact, they had intensified. She noticed unmarked police cars parked outside her home, and she could sense eyes watching her when she moved through the city. But each glance in her direction, each silent threat, only steeled her resolve further. Naya knew that fear was their most powerful weapon, and she refused to let it control her. Word of her confrontation with Mathers at the rally had spread quickly, and it became a rallying cry for her supporters. "Stand with Naya" became a popular slogan on social media and on protest signs. The story had transcended the local community, gaining national attention. Naya's inbox overflowed with messages from people across the country, other lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens, who shared their own experiences with police harassment and offered their support. Meanwhile, Mathers was emboldened by his position in the police force. Despite mounting complaints, he held his head high, believing he was untouchable. He continued to paint Naya as an agitator, a troublemaker who had turned the community against law enforcement. The department, under pressure from both sides, had remained silent, unwilling to take decisive action against one of their own, but also feeling the heat from the public demand for justice. One evening, Naya received a call from her mentor. "Naya," her mentor's voice was calm but urgent. "I think it's time we escalate this to the next level." "What do you mean?" Naya asked, feeling a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. "There's a reporter at a national news outlet who's interested in covering your story. I've spoken with her, and she wants to do an in-depth interview about your experiences with Mathers, the workshops, the rally, everything. This could be the breakthrough we need to bring real accountability." Naya took a deep breath, weighing the decision. She knew that stepping into the national spotlight would come with increased risks, but it would also amplify her voice in ways she hadn't yet experienced. It was an opportunity to show the world that justice was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "I'll do it," she said, her voice filled with determination. A week later, Naya sat in a brightly lit studio, preparing to share her story on national television. The reporter, a sharp and empathetic woman named Carla, had been thorough in her research. Carla understood the stakes and had spent hours speaking with Naya and others in her community to understand the full scope of her fight. The interview began with Carla asking Naya about her background, her work as a civil rights attorney, and the events that had led to her first encounter with Mathers. Naya recounted the details with clarity and honesty, painting a vivid picture of the intimidation and harassment she had faced since then. "What keeps you going, Naya?" Carla asked, her eyes filled with admiration. "What gives you the courage to stand up against such powerful opposition?" Naya paused, gathering her thoughts. "I grew up hearing stories from my grandparents about the civil rights movement," she said, her voice steady. "They fought for equality and justice with everything they had, even when the cost was high. I knew that if they could stand up against so much adversity, I could too. And more than that, I'm doing this for the community, for those who feel like they don't have a voice. I want them to know that they matter, that they're not alone." The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Naya's story resonated with viewers across the nation, sparking debates and conversations in households, workplaces, and communities. People began organizing marches and rallies in cities far beyond Atlanta, demanding justice and police reform. Nia had become a symbol of resilience and bravery, and her fight was now part of a larger movement. Back in Atlanta, however, the tension was reaching a boiling point. Mathers, infuriated by the national attention, began to lash out in increasingly aggressive ways. His frustration with Nia's growing influence had turned into a personal vendetta, and he was determined to silence her once and for all. One night, as Nia was leaving her office, she felt a sense of unease. The usually busy street was eerily quiet, and shadows seemed to lurk around every corner. She quickened her pace, clutching her bag tightly. Just as she turned onto a dimly lit street, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart raced, but she kept walking, determined not to show fear. "Nia," a familiar voice called out. She turned and saw Mathers standing a few feet away, his face twisted with anger. "What do you want, Mathers?" she asked, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you can drag my name through the mud and get away with it? I'm not dragging your name through anything, Mathers. Your actions have done that for you," Nia replied, her tone calm but firm. "You abused your power, and now you're facing the consequences." Mathers took a step closer, his face flushed with rage. "You don't know who you're messing with. I can ruin you, Nia. I can make all of this go away with a single phone call." Nia felt a surge of anger, but she refused to let him see her falter. "Go ahead, make that call. I'll be here, standing up for what's right, while you hide behind your threats. I won't back down." For a moment, they stood there in silence, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Mathers turned and walked away, his shoulders tense with barely contained fury. Nia watched him go, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. She had faced him down once again, but she knew this was far from over. The next morning, Nia's office was flooded with calls and emails from people who had seen the interview. She received messages of support from activists, lawyers, and even law enforcement officers who wanted to stand with her in the fight for justice. Among the messages was one from a high-ranking official in the Department of Justice. The message read, "Ms. Robinson, we've been following your case closely. We'd like to open an investigation into Officer Mathers and his conduct, as well as the practices within the Atlanta Police Department. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." Nia felt a rush of hope and validation. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. With the support of the DOJ, they could finally bring Mathers to justice and expose the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to abuse their power. She immediately contacted the DOJ, arranging a meeting to provide all the evidence she had gathered. Over the following weeks, she worked tirelessly with federal investigators, sharing stories from her community, documentation from her encounters with Mathers, and accounts from others who had suffered at his hands. The investigation gained momentum, and soon enough, Mathers found himself under intense scrutiny. His fellow officers, who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior, began to distance themselves from him, fearful of being implicated. The thin blue line that had protected Mathers was beginning to fray. Finally, after months of investigation, the DOJ held a press conference to announce their findings. Mathers was to be charged with multiple counts of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power. The Atlanta Police Department was placed under federal oversight, with sweeping reforms mandated to prevent future abuses. The day the charges were announced, Nia stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, supporters, and members of her community. She felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. This was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had suffered in the shadows. As she addressed the crowd, Nia's voice was filled with emotion. "Today, we took a stand against injustice. We showed that no one is above the law, that we all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. This is not the end of our journey, it's just the beginning. Together, we will continue to fight for a world where justice is truly for all." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. She had fought hard, and she had won, not just for herself, but for her community, for her city, and for the countless others who would benefit from this change. As she walked away from the courthouse that day, Nia knew there would still be battles ahead. But she was no longer fighting alone. She had a movement at her side, and together, they were unstoppable.